We do have this breaking news just into CNN. That is, the Wagner mercenary group chief, Yevgeny Prigohzin, has been listed among passengers on board a plane that crashed just north of Moscow. This, according to Russian state media. You may remember that Prigohzin and his Wagner group led an attempted mutiny coup against the Russian president 2 months ago to the day, on June 23rd. He made his way close to Moscow before turning around, and now 2 months later, CNN is reporting that the chief listed among those on the passengers of this plane that crashed north of Moscow. Our Fred Pleitkin covers Russia extensively for us. He joins us now from Berlin. Fred, I don't need to say that this is shocking news. It comes just 2 months after this attempted coup. Prigohzin had enormous power inside Russia as head of the Wagner military group. Tell me what you're hearing about this and the significance.
Hi there, Jim. And obviously, we are still in the very early stages of this, but you're absolutely right. This could be potentially huge news with Yevgeny Prigohzin on that passenger list. We are hearing some of this from Russian state media, some of it also from the Russian Federal Aviation Administration. I want to read you some of what Russian media is quoting from the Federal Russian Aviation Administration. They're saying, quote, "An investigation has been launched into the crash of the Embraer aircraft, which occurred tonight in the Tver region." That's a region that's sort of north of Moscow, south of St. Petersburg. We, of course, know that Yevgeny Prigohzin has essentially his headquarters in St. Petersburg, even though large parts of his organization have moved to Belarus. In the Tver region, according to the list of passengers, among them is the surname of Yevgeny Prigohzin, it says. There, we're also hearing that possibly 10 people in total were on board that aircraft, that aircraft is an Embraer 160, an aircraft like that owned by Yevgeny Prigohzin's company, by Yevgeny Prigohzin himself. So possibly this could be very big news, as the Russians are treating this very much as possibly Yevgeny Prigohzin being on that aircraft. Obviously, right now, his whereabouts very much unknown. One of the things that's really interesting about this is that we do know that Yevgeny Prigohzin was traveling abroad, Jim. We do know that he was in Africa at least a couple of days ago. There was a video that he released saying that his forces, his Wagner forces, were now working in Africa, that it was very hot there, but he was on the ground there as well, claiming that those forces were fighting against ISIS. Of course, as you very correctly stated, Yevgeny Prigohzin started that mutiny on June 24th, about 2 months ago, which failed, which was then called back, obviously a big threat to Vladimir Putin. And there were many people who were wondering about Yevgeny Prigohzin's safety and whether or not there could be payback from Vladimir Putin or from the Russian security services. Again, still very much unclear what exactly is going on, what exactly happened there, but certainly this potentially could be very, very big news coming out of Russia, Jim.
That's right. You mentioned that video from 2 days ago. I believe we were playing just a clip of it. We could play it again, in which he spoke about Wagner's exploits in Africa as making, in his words, Africa freer. We should note Prigohzin's Wagner group is operated as really a private military for the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Prigohzin, close to the Russian president. He was known for a time as Putin's chef, although his role much greater than that. He also played a role in the 2016 Russian interference in the U.S. election, leading the group that helped interfere and spread false news here in the U.S. And to Fred's point, you cannot mention today's events, as Russian state media reporting that he was on the list of passengers of this plane that went down. You cannot mention those events without mentioning events from 2 months ago when Prigohzin was the man who unsuccessfully led a coup against the Russian president, Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, and I think one of the big questions, obviously, at that time was, what is the fate going to be of Yevgeny Prigohzin? And so there are going to be a lot of questions about, obviously, what has happened here.
Absolutely. And
about certainly how this is going to maybe affect the dynamics of a war that we are seeing fought in Ukraine by Russia. I do want to bring in Nick Payton-Walsh. He is there in Ukraine for us. Nick, this is quite a bombshell that we are learning that Yevgeny Prigohzin listed among these passengers on board this plane that has crashed north of Moscow.
Yeah, it's important to remind people, though, that him being on the list of passengers doesn't automatically equate to him having been on that plane. It does appear from the images we're seeing and the reports we're hearing from Russian state media that those on board have indeed perished. Remember, Russian state media is not Yevgeny Prigozhin's friend, frankly, at the moment. He's the man who led that unsuccessful coup and then disappeared for a number of days, and it's fair to say he's a man who's good at hiding his whereabouts. The fact he's listed on this very rare aircraft, you don't see many of them flying around, frankly, Russia at all, doesn't immediately suggest that he had to have been on the aircraft, though we are dealing with an extraordinary moment potentially, which is the question that so many had asked: how does this man, Yevgeny Prigozhin, who appeared to have led that coup and then changed his mind radically on the way to Moscow, how did he stay alive this long? Though those who've even half upset Vladimir Putin as much in the past have met a grisly end, fallen from windows, some critics, some poisoned as well. Prigozhin essentially led an armed rebellion against the Kremlin head, yet lived, and as you said, Jim, was seen in Africa a matter of days ago. And so many Kremlin watchers were wondering, how precisely did he manage to survive? Was a deal cut? We know of the public deal arranged by a man who Putin had scorn for, frankly, the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, that essentially appeared to have turned Wagner's troops round on the way to Moscow. But what happened to Prigozhin next was going to be an exceptionally difficult question to answer. We've heard from today from Russian officials the suggestion that one of the Russian generals who were thought to have been close to the Wagner head, Prigozhin, have suddenly been removed quietly from their post after suggestion they've been under house arrest for some time, General Surovikin. And so this fate potentially comes at a similar time as that. But it's important to point out to people we know little at this time. This is a moment potentially where people might suggest that Yevgeny Prigozhin now disappears for a while. We don't know if he's been listed on that plane. Does he emerge shortly and say to everybody he's actually fine? Did he get back from Africa suddenly very quickly and find himself on this private jet? A lot of questions to be answered here, but it's important to point out these are state media channels, and the state agency Rosaviatsia telling us that he's indeed on that private jet. That may not have happened by accident. We're still, I think, trying to work out what's really happened here, but if state messages are this clear, there may be a bid to suggest that Prigozhin was indeed on that plane, the fate of which is now clear, Jim.
No question. It's important to inject that question because we don't know for certain he was on the plane. We do know, as you say, that state media is reporting he was listed on the passengers on board, and this was a plane that he was known to use. We should also note, as a matter of context, that the Russian president has not hesitated to kill his opponents in a number of ways. He used radioactive materials to kill Litvinenko in London. He attempted to kill Alexei Navalny using a nerve agent. As Nick referenced, there are a lot of officials who stood up to the Russian president who've fallen out of windows accidentally or otherwise.
Many of them.
Another one was famously shot quite close to the Kremlin.